Alright, it's one of those days again where I managed to work up the determination to hop on the good old Google Docs and knock out another script for a video. I'm always on the lookout for good video ideas and want to read a lot more literature surrounding philosophy, so if you guys have any recommendations, let me know. At the moment, I'm at the start of Albert Camus' Myth of Sisyphus, so don't be surprised if a video about suicide comes out soon after this one. Though, let's get to the point for both your sake, my own, and my viewer retention rate. Can you prove that anything exists? Well, surely you have to exist because you're watching the video and wondering what a stupid question that is. Okay, so then I might ask, can you prove that anything that isn't you exists? Still sounds pretty dumb, but wouldn't you know there's an entire line of thinking behind this theory? Not that there's necessarily any reason to exactly believe it's true, but it's sort of one of those things like wondering if aliens are real and being able to say that even though we haven't met any, it's totally possible. In fact, we might talk about aliens, but I'm trying to pin the tail on the idea of solipsism. I'm here to remind everyone that I'm no expert in any sense, but hopefully my perspective at least lands in the ballpark of entertainment or sparking a good thought or two. But then let's get you, me, and solipsism a little more familiar with one another. Solipsism, of which a lot of the modern interpretation is attributed to Descartes, who came up with the absolute word bang of I think, therefore I am, is at its base form the theory that the only thing we can 100% confidently say to exist is ourselves. Ourselves, of course, isn't really referring to anything tangible, but rather what we would call our consciousness or whatever medium by which we think. Of course, this would also mean reality and the entire cosmos effectively or simply constructed by your own mind for whatever reason. It can also be said, interestingly enough, that it's also possible that while our mind is definitely sure to exist, it might also be possible that simply half of everything else exists and the other half is constructed by our mind. For our own purposes, though, we're going to assume that I exist in your construction of my mind, and also simultaneously that I don't exist and am simply a construction of your mind, whatever isolates a single mind as being what exists. Now, this sounds far-fetched at first, but just a little thinking gets us around to its plausibility. Everything which we consider existing within our own life is a deduction only made possible by processing said information through our conscious selves. Without our consciousness, in a personal sense, nothing really exists. We also know that our brains can be a bit wacky sometimes and show us things that aren't really there, whether you've been driving for a day straight or are on psychedelics. For schizophrenic individuals, sounds and images that aren't really there are a component of daily life. I mean, we can quite literally create realities that don't actually exist in our minds, whether it be through a fantasy novel or something more practically conceived like within a dream. So, for solipsism, and assuming that we're the only thing which exists, everything else can be viewed as a grand expansion of the previous examples I described. Everything in existence is something conjured by your own consciousness for whatever reason, and you navigate this world defining it as you comprehend it, creating a story and living it out at the same time. Though this has a lot of implications and questions to be thrown in alongside it that either undermine or explain its plausibility. Which is great because I want to talk about some of them that particularly pique profound interest in my person. Before this, though, we must make the assumption that we are effectively omnipotent. This sounds strange, but we must, in some capacity, be knowledgeable of everything that exists because everything that exists is the creation of our own consciousness. But we're actively learning new things in what we would call our life. For this specific reason, I'll suggest that we have a superconsciousness which creates and is knowing of our reality and manages our inferior consciousness, which is the experience we actively hold. They are technically the same consciousness, but one exists within the other and provides the potential explanation for why we're simultaneously the creator of everything that exists and an individual which learns about things they don't yet know. I figured that first, before we get to the abstract, I'd like to point out a couple things that sort of diminish solipsism's plausibility in a few cases. I think that the idea of memories becoming distorted over time throws a particular wrench in the idea that our consciousness is what comprises the world. We can all agree that the world is a complicated place of which there are many things we have a hard time understanding or even knowing the slightest bit about to any meaningful capacity, at least in our inferior form. But to say our consciousness is the only thing that exists is to also say that it's the creator of our own reality, complicated or not in its totality. I can concede that perhaps new scientific discoveries or experiences are simply constructed by our superior consciousness and are not accessible to us in the experience of the inferior consciousness for whatever reason or purpose. Though it seems an incredible stretch to say that even past this assumption, we constantly misremember occurrences, images, and circumstances altogether. Should we be capable to some extent of incredibly complex thinking, though self-limiting in some respects, it seems like a completely unnecessary feature in terms of entertainment or sanity to make it so that experiences or knowledge we have already established as known to whittle away over time. My introduction also got me thinking about aliens as well, specifically foreign life forms which are as capable of or more capable in terms of intellectual feats than humans. Perhaps it would make sense that given our only human capable understanding of the world, our upper consciousness would not be able to comprehend the existence of more intellectually capable beings than ourselves, and this fact is reflected in their non-existence in our world. It's sort of like God trying to make another God that's better than himself. But even this seems like a lacking perspective given the fact that if we assume our superior consciousness is the creator of our reality, we are as knowledgeable as everything that exists, and our experiencing form is what can slowly gain access to this information. Therefore, the need for no other incredibly intelligent life seems pretty unnecessary. This is getting a tad long for my usual style of video, so I'll simply staple on the fact that life can suck. If our inferior consciousness is an extension of our superior one, the existence of pain and suffering seems incredibly deliberate and simultaneously masochistic for no good reason. It doesn't even really matter if my superior consciousness has some cosmic understanding of the integrity of suffering, because they made my inferior self intentionally a being which doesn't appreciate it either way. There are other more interesting implications of solipsism though, one of which you already heard about being that we must be omnipotent, in some sense of which I sought to describe, because everything is a figment of our own consciousness. Immortality was another circumstance that came to mind when I was thinking about what could be insinuated by being the only thing to ever exist. If our consciousness is the only thing which exists, surely we don't just die and then leave everything as being nothing. Perhaps our superior consciousness simply makes a new inferior one, or simply remolds ourselves and the world to its own liking, sort of like a reincarnation of everything that exists. This also begs the question that if our inferior consciousness is just as replaceable as anything else, what of everyone else? Sure, it's not really for me to put a limit on what the consciousness is capable of creating, but other people are incredibly unique and capable of their own deliberations or thoughts by their lonesome. Could it be that we are also everyone else and everything else? It seems plausible. The superior consciousness creates everything, but everything is not its own existence, it's something that exists within the consciousness in this case. Then is who I am simply one inferior consciousness? Is every individual another partitioned and innovated inferior conscious of which we are all connected to the same grander source? Yeah, that's definitely going to be a stretch, but the best part is that when the only thing you can really know is yourself, everything else is a practical game of literal imagination being reality. I've thrown you guys, or at least myself, for a nonsensical loop here, but it's really done nothing to change the original claim of solipsism. Maybe my so-called funny rebuttals are just intentions that only my superconscious can ascertain, or this is a whole bunch of gibberish which does sound more plausible. Even without the assumption of some grand superconsciousness though, it doesn't really seem that I can know anything to exist beyond myself. That's kind of the whole shining attractiveness of the theory, though. It's not necessarily to tell us that we must be the only thing that exists, but that we can at least be sure we do, even if it's only ourselves. That's a pretty nice thought to end on, but I don't really know what else you might learn from this, but I hope you enjoyed my rambling here nonetheless. This sounds pretty cringy to hear myself say, but if you enjoyed the content, please consider liking and subscribing. I also love reading comments, but either way, have a good day and remember to stay wet.